Hello, this is your host, Ty Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. I am again joined by Right Ruminations, here to discuss the libertarian concept of the non-aggression principle. So, why don't you get us started, Right Ruminations?
The first that I encountered anything that looked like the non-aggression principle was about 15 years ago when I read Ayn Rand. I don't know if there is any serious distinction between the non-aggression principle in theory, the way it's discussed today, and the way she describes it. But she, to my knowledge, didn't call it that. It's essentially the view that it's categorically wrong to initiate aggressive force, and that therefore aggressive force is only to be used in retaliation or self-defense against prior acts of aggression. This is usually formulated along some kind of either deontological or natural law framework, that is to say, some kind of categorical framework. It is then applied to the broader question of politics. Theorists at this point take it and decide questions about intellectual property rights, whether those exist, whether one has the right to, say, sell oneself into slavery, what kind of society should be organized, can the state exist, can the non-aggression principle be made compatible with the state, and questions of these natures, of this nature. It is then a general principle which is then applied along different lines of interpretation. Murray Rothbard credits Ayn Rand, according to Justin Raimondo, with his understanding of natural law as the basis of individual liberty. It should be noted that non-aggression principle usually presupposes the existence of private property rights. How that justification is made, it differs from theorist to theorist. Another way of putting it is that aggression is always wrong if one is the first to initiate it. And in addition to that, private assaults on private property do constitute aggression. There are a number of different ways of applying this on a macro level. The objectivists and the disciples of Ayn Rand believe that the state is necessary to facilitate this non-aggression principle and to enforce, to institutionalize the retaliation in the form of either restitution or retribution against aggression. Devout followers of Rothbard, with some exceptions like Ron Paul, believe that it is something which precludes the existence of the state itself, because forcing people to not provide for private legal systems or private defense mechanisms to the fullest extent is itself an act of aggression. That's sort of an introduction to the idea of the non-aggression principle. Final introductory note would be that there is a distinction between the ways that different people try to justify it. But what separates it from anarcho-capitalism as such is that anarcho-capitalism or libertarianism could be justified on other grounds, like pragmatism, such as the case with David Friedman. What I would say is that even though some NAP theorists resort to Lockean natural law arguments and other ones resort to more a prioristic Kantian type arguments, that in one way or another, it does constitute something that could at least be mistaken for a natural law outlook as opposed to a utilitarian one.
Yes. So the classic formulation of the non-aggression principle that I'm familiar with is the one that was more commonly advocated by anarcho-capitalists and these radical libertarians, that aggression being defined as force or fraud was impermissible against property or persons. Persons, of course, being just another form of property, as Hoppe says, human rights or property rights. And before we even get to the justification of the non-aggression principle, the non-aggression principle, as defined this way, isn't very helpful, because almost nobody is going to say that force and fraud is justified. What they are going to disagree over is what constitutes fraud and force. So, for example, if you choose not to take care of your offspring and let them die to neglect, most people are going to consider that fraud and force, but not libertarians. And I'm like, okay, that's one way to look at it. MRAs and MGTOW would view women and the way they carry themselves with their neotic, childlike mannerisms as a kind of fraud in order to get men to do what they want for them. Libertarians would not consider that fraud at all. But if you're going to fake your SMV, that is by definition fraud. Also, the libertarian might say, well, it's not really fraud or force if the landlord requires you to pay a rent. But then the socialist says, with some measure of applicability, how is being a tenant paying rent any different than a citizen paying taxes? It's essentially the same kind of relationship. The libertarians would say it's voluntary, and therefore voluntary is that key factor that makes it not aggression and not force. But, again, what is voluntary for one isn't necessarily voluntary for another. As we've seen within the libertarian community itself, there's been a debate over whether abortion is a violation of the NAP. You've got Hoppe's evictionism, which states, Hoppe Block's evictionism, which states that you can evict somebody who's a trespasser with ever-increasing levels of violence, starting with the least threatening to the most threatening. But then, is that even a relevant comparison, since the child, the pro-life libertarian would advocate, was in some sense invited onto the property? Really, it's almost tautological and only internally relational. It doesn't really help you figure out what is fraud and what is aggression.
I think that I view the libertarian position as more consistent, in that it is a situation where if you have people who are what the libertarians would call statists, that is, people who, let's say, believe in taxation, or let's say believe that there should be restrictions on what drugs you can use on your own private property, that anyone who says that these are not acts of force, that these laws are not acts of force, is not being honest, because there is an element of consistency if you just try to figure out what binds all of these libertarians' conceptions of force, regardless of the distinctions. I would say that force would be the violation of objective autonomy against the will of the person who is in control of the goods in question. That is then something that can be applied in different ways. So you will have libertarians like Tom Woods who do defend the idea that you can compel parents to feed their children because they put them in that situation. So they have an obligation to to not basically sign a death warrant that was made inevitable by their decision to have a child. Likewise, with something like abortion, it really comes down to is the fetus a child or not, and then libertarians have a disagreement on application. If you were to deal with something like MGTOW or MRA saying that women being flirtatious or being deceptive and wearing makeup or something like this is fraud, I think that a reasonably intelligent libertarian would be able to come back at that and say that the difference is that this is persuasion more than fraud. Fraud is the idea that you are holding something on the condition that you live up to a certain stipulation that you then fail to live up to. So if I take your money in exchange for a compact disc and I don't give you the compact disc, or I give you a faulty one, then I'm holding your money implicitly by force. But I think what they would say is that it's a matter of circumstantial application with the woman who's being deceptively flirtatious. In other words, if she says, I will only have sexual intercourse with you, or you have the let's agree that you will have sexual intercourse with me if I really do look like this and I'm not wearing makeup, and then it turns out she was wearing makeup, then that would be fraud because that was a very clear stipulation. But if it's just she's wearing makeup, everyone knows what makeup is, she's being flirtatious, everyone knows what flirtatious is, that's decidedly something that a reasonably discerning adult will be able to distinguish from fraud per se. I really will defend the libertarians, and that I think that they are, their opinions are not, their view with respect to the NAP is not as epistemically certain as they like to make it out to be. I do believe that there is an internal consistency in that what appear to be discrepancies are really just differences in application based on different understandings of particular facts. So that's my view on that.
Okay. The next element is then what constitutes legitimate property, because obviously aggression or fraud is actions taking illegitimately to acquire property. And then now they'll say there's 3 ways to legitimately acquire property: mix your labor with unowned resources, have it purchase it through lawful exchange, and or having it given to you as a gift. Now, this is where the first problem gets in with the idea of grounding the non-aggression principle. If human rights are property rights, and the rights to our body are in some meaningful way analogous to rights to property, then it's really impossible to envision how I could acquire ownership over my body in any of those 3 ways. I mixed my labor with myself. That is a nonsense statement. I would have to exist before I existed. I couldn't have purchased it because it wasn't there yet before I was born. And I couldn't have been gifted it for the same reason. And so if those are the only 3 legitimate ways to acquire private property, then it's difficult to envision how your body is your own private property. Now, if they want to insist on this unique, inexplicable exception, well, then they run into another problem, because many of these libertarians would agree with Stefan Kinsella's argument against intellectual property, in such that intellectual property is some uniquely idiosyncratic definition of property that isn't universalizable, that isn't used in normal context. Therefore, we should reject it. Well, fair enough, but what's good for the goose is good for the gander. By the same rationale, self-ownership of the body is an extremely idiosyncratic and non-normative definition of property and should be rejected.
I was listening to a lecture that Stefan Kinsella gave today. Oh, he didn't give it today. I was listening to it today. And he was talking about these questions. It seems to me that the failure to make the distinct, or the desire to overcome this seeming inconsistency that you pointed out of how can you own yourself or your own labor, is something that leads libertarians into peculiar positions, like what we discussed briefly before starting the show, wherein, because they think that there is some contradiction here, they try to more uniformly define the non-aggression principle as don't violate private property, as opposed to don't violate private property plus don't violate persons. This is something that then leads to unusual conclusions, like you cannot obligate yourself to do something in the future and therefore can't go to debtor's prison. And in this sense, I almost agree. You almost agree more with the libertarians that I do, in that there does seem to be this sort of contradiction that needs to be worked out. How can you own your own free will? How can you own your own bodily autonomy? And therefore, how can you sell yourself into slavery? But my view is actually that, in this sense, the libertarians almost don't give themselves enough credit. I don't really see why they would presuppose the self to be unitary. There's no reason one could not say that the self has control over another part of the self. That is, that the agency of the person has ownership of the labor, or has ownership of the body, that there could be a dualistic distinction made in this case, in which case it's perfectly consistent to imagine that you could sell yourself into slavery, or that you could sell yourself into some future obligation. I think that it really is just a matter of the fact that libertarians themselves often don't acknowledge the multitude of ways that the thing that they're saying could be defined or described in different ways, and therefore they kind of back themselves into unique quandaries. But it looks like you have an answer to that, so go ahead.
Yeah, I think the reason why it's a problem. Okay, it's a problem in this sense. Libertarianism, even though there are Christian libertarians to whom this is actually less of a problem, and then just libertarians qua libertarians, is a philosophy that they claim again and again is independent of any sort of religious or metaphysical distinctions, and is implicitly atheistic. In fact, because Rothbard, Rand, and Mises were all atheists, and many of the current proponents, like I know Block is. I don't know about Hoppe, and I'm not sure about Consilla either, but they give every impression of at least being agnostic. Yes, if we believed in substance-soul dualism, then the soul could be that which owns the body. That's a very real possibility. But libertarianism, as a metaphysical analysis of the human person, generally rejects any idea of the soul or mind-brain duality. And as such, that does become a problem.
Well, I guess I would answer that by saying that it is, first of all, that there are a lot of libertarians who are what Ayn Rand would call mystics. That is, who are I shouldn't say metaphysical, because she did consider herself a metaphysician, but they are religious, to put it directly. Once again, using examples of Lew Rockwell or Tom Woods or possibly Jeffrey Tucker, I think. And you will find that there is this kind of affection for Christianity in, say, the pages of LewRockwell.com. But even with the atheistic ones, now, this could turn into a discussion of atheism and whether atheistic philosophers themselves are consistent. But what I would say is that there are atheist philosophies that would be compatible with this distinction. I would not say that the rationalists of the early modern period were atheists, or certainly they weren't openly, but you will find that there are, say, Kantian or Descartesian dualists who don't necessarily posit a soul-body distinction so much as a mind-body distinction. And so that you could argue that those even do constitute sort of separate or distinct biological entities that would be very 17th century in character, but I think that one could make a case for that.
Well, sure, one could conceivably do so. I think another application problem is something that you hinted at as the justification for the non-aggression axiom. Both Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard argue that if one does not have a right to the produce of one's labor and does not have the right to freely exercise his reason to survive in nature, well, then he couldn't survive in nature. And so the whole point of this principle is to guarantee those rights necessary for man to survive in nature. Here's the problem. Libertarians have had a problematic, and objectivists have had a problematic relationship towards children. If you fail to provide children with those means necessary to survive, and your entire worldview philosophy is sold on the presupposition that it is the only means by which human beings can survive in a hostile world, you've literally shot yourself in the foot. And furthermore, socialists could make, with using similar assumptions, argue that the right to food, clothes, shelter, and an education are required for life and for living in this hostile environment. And by denying even adults those things, the libertarians are making it unlikely humanity would survive into the future. So when you relate your ideology so closely with the presupposition that you are the only philosophy that allows people to survive in a hostile universe into the future, but then fail to take into account these points, it does leave you in a very ticklish situation.
Let's see. I would concede part of that point and not another part. I'll say the thing where I would disagree with that is that I do think you could probably say that because the parents bring the children into the world, that they are thereby conceding to a certain protective mechanism. So if you say make a contract with a business, that is, you contract a construction business to build a house, well, you're making certain concessions, such as they can use the land on which you want them to build the house, that they can occupy that space, that maybe they'll be like smoking cigarettes on the premises or whatever, the number of different implicit things. But you could say the same with the child, that you know that they can't survive, that you are basically putting them in a fatal position, and so that there are therefore certain built-in mechanisms in place that are presumed on the part of the procreator. That would be the part where I disagree. The part where I would agree, and this may be the deeper point that is being gotten at, is that they are arguing something as if it were purely a prioristic and saying, well, this is how man survives, that man must have access to these certain venues or these certain objects, these certain opportunities, what have you, if he is to survive, which then just becomes an empirical question, because obviously for the majority of human history, man did survive, and he was not operating according to the non-aggression principle by any stretch of the imagination. So if it is necessary for man's survival, then it's only a partial recognition of the non-aggression principle is necessary for his survival, because he has survived without it. And really, it just kind of begs the empirical question of, is that the is the non-aggression principle in practice that situation whereby human survival is optimized, which maybe it is, but at that point you would have to admit that you are more of a pragmatist or an empiricist than you're letting on, in which case you should give more of an acknowledgement to that effect in the way that someone like David Friedman does.
Exactly. Now, I think the next step to go to is there are three classic attempts to justify and ground in first principles the concept of self-ownership. There's Murray Rothbard in The Ethics of the New Liberty with his trilemma. There's Stefan Kinsella with his objective link with an article of the same title. And there's Hans Hermann Hoppe and his argumentation ethics. So let's begin with Rothbard. Rothbard takes a view similar to C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia, where C.S. Lewis says either Christ was a madman, a liar, or telling the truth. And then we by process of elimination, according to Lewis, come to the conclusion that Christ was telling the truth. Well, Rothbard says there are three possibilities for self-ownership. One is the libertarian concept that we own ourselves. Then the other one is that A owns B completely. So, and then the other one is that everybody has an equal quotal share ownership of someone else. Having set up these three positions, Rothbard then says, well, two of these are just absurd, leaving us with self-ownership. Now, the problem here is that in such a process of elimination of possibilities, Rothbard, to make his point, would have to cover all the possibilities and then one by one eliminate them, leaving us only with the non-aggression axiom, which he has not done. And as pointed out by Ed Feser, there are numerous other counterexamples that Rothbard fails to consider. A, no one owns anyone, which is the position of Professor Mavrodos, which Rothbard eventually gets to later. God owns all of us. That was the position of John Locke. One class of people has a right to only partial ownership of another class, or everyone has partial and or unequal ownership of everyone else. So that's at least 7 alternatives now. And Rothbard has only dealt with at most 3 of them because he does eventually deal with Mavrodos. But his entire dilemma strategy doesn't work because he hasn't failed to take into account all the other possibilities that would have to be eliminated for this to be the only standing position. The other thing, Rothbard makes a couple of claims that just don't hold up under scrutiny. Rothbard says that if we don't have the right to own property and the right to use our reason, then we could not survive. Well, animals don't have the right to property. And even some of the higher mammals who have a kind of crude reason, like dogs and rats and mice and some of even like birds and the octopus, could never have property. Yet despite the fact that they need food and land to live on, but don't have the right to the proceeds of their labor, unquote, they survive just fine. So it's not a precondition for survival. Rothbard was just empirically wrong on that. And furthermore, he makes the other claim that, well, if we have a range of control over something, that constitutes a form of ownership. Well, all animals that exist have a range of control over the environment. But Rothbard says ipso facto animals cannot have rights. Well, if animals have a range of control over the environment but don't have rights, therefore the range of control over the environment is not a sufficient condition for humans to have rights. And so Rothbard, at the end of the day, has not in any way grounded this principle in any sort of a priori axiomatic thinking that he strove to do. And until someone finishes that project that Rothbard began by tightening up the arguments and dealing with the other alternatives, one would have to conclude that that particular project has failed to demonstrate the axiomatic nature of the non-aggression principle.
I think that a lot of these problems are language problems. I think that to a large extent, libertarians and non-aggression theorists do rely on a kind of language of this or that. So if it's not, it reminds me of something actually that a music theorist from the 16th century said, and anyone, this is just a kind of maybe Easter egg, if you will, for anybody who knows music theory, that someone was talking about, can you move in parallel fifths from an open fifth to a tritone? And the teacher in the book says, well, the objection saying that you can do this is, well, they're not the same thing, so it's not really moving in parallel fifths. And then the person says, well, is the tritone a fourth? And the student says no, and the teacher says, well, is the tritone a fifth? Is it a sixth? And the student says no, and he says, well, it must be a fifth, therefore the two notes are the same. And it is this kind of like sidestepping language that's very modern. In a sense, it's modern, but in a sense, it's also Aristotelian that the libertarians use that probably could have benefited from more of the kind of critique that Bertrand Russell used with his example of the King of France is bald, somehow implying that there must be a King of France. I think that there is this sort of almost immature rationalism in the language employed by libertarians. But I will say that, in a sense, maybe more credit is due to Ayn Rand on this level, because Ayn Rand does have an answer to the objection that you raised, in that it is animals can survive without reason because their natural disposition is to survive by instinct, whereas man doesn't have any great force of muscle. He does not have the same instinctive prowess as beasts. And so as an animal, he has a different survival mechanism, which is to use his intellectual reason to act on the external environment. And therefore, this is something that almost constitutes a natural law that can be read into the humans as part of their essential survival mechanism. Birds have wings, humans have reason. Now, in a sense, Ayn Rand deserves more credit for this, and in a sense, she doesn't. One of the reasons that she doesn't deserve the credit, I'll start with that, is because she is basically, on the one hand, claiming to be this rationalist who has given voice to these immutable a priori truths, but this is obviously an empirical claim that's made in relation to observations about the external world. However, where she's in the right is that she is living up to her claim to in some way be a descendant of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, and that this is a kind of natural theological argument. But then bizarrely contradicts how she described herself in terms of being the ultimate rationalist. The real point being that the non-aggression principle is best proven when it resorts to some kind of empirical inference, which seems to be something that, to one extent or another, that non-aggression theorists are allergic to.
Mm-hmm. The second attempt to ground the non-aggression axiom in first principles is to find Kinsella's the objective link. When it comes to unknown property, he takes the conventional idea that the objective link is first use. But of course, with your own body, first use is not something that's very helpful. So he says that it is the unique relationship between a person and his body, his direct and immediate control over the body, and the fact that, at least in some sense, a body is a given person and vice versa. So basically the argument would go like this: what gives me a better claim to my body than someone else? He later quotes Hoppe, who says that if I were to send, brain/mental commands to my arm to rise it up in the air, to wave it, and it does that, and nobody else could think that about my arm and it would respond in kind, that demonstrates a better claim that I have to my arm than anyone else would have. Well, there's some problems with that. Some hypothetical, some actual. What if your brain/mind were some way impaired such that it could not issue commands through the nervous system to your arm? Maybe you suffered brain damage. Maybe you suffered nerve damage. Maybe some sophisticated scientific lobotomies taking place. And no matter how hard you think it, your arm will never rise up. Does that mean you don't have a good claim to your arm anymore? That would seem a very odd thing to do. And furthermore, what if somebody were to control your mind, like, say, the mule from Isaac Asimov's The Foundation series? He would then command your mind to do what he wanted. Does then he have a better claim to your body than you do? Or what if, in a classic science fiction experiment, you switched bodies with someone else and your mental commands were operating on someone else's body? Is that now your body and your old body is someone else? it shows that the objective link isn't nearly as objective as Kinsella thinks it is and doesn't really advance his cause much at all.
I think that this is something that is easy to imagine if you think of somebody who had developed the ability to control humans mentally before they even became rational agents. So before they, let's say, to use for the sake of argument, Catholic language, that you were already in control of them telepathically before they even before the person even reaches the age of reason. In which case, that person has essentially been homesteaded. That's really by that definition. There's not much. There's not really a way of getting around that I know of. I remember that in your debate with Stefan Kinsella, when you brought this up, and he essentially dismissed the example out of hand as not really existing and therefore not pertinent. But I mean, nothing is existent until it happens. I think the point is that you have to deal with it as a thought experiment because it is not a metaphysical impossibility. And to be honest, I'm not even entirely sure it's a physical impossibility. It doesn't sound. I mean, at one point, not that long ago, if you told someone that we'd be able to have a live stream like this across a vast distance in real time, and that these objects would perfectly record our voices and our appearances, they would have said you were insane. So it's not really that impossible to imagine some kind of extra personal control if science were to develop in that way. I might joke that maybe that's the next frontier of libertarian thought. So just like you can have a non-aggression principle private monarchy, maybe you can have like homesteaded slavery or something if you get there before the person reaches the age of reason. I would say that this is really just further grounds for basically, if I were to take the libertarian side on this, for basically trying to emphasize the, you might say, non-uniqueness of the person, and an emphasis on the dualistic interpretation, wherein, or perhaps not the dualistic interpretation per se. Let me reorganize this thought. I think that here Kinsella is suffering from an absence of that thing I identified with Ayn Rand, in that if he were willing to say that it is a question of you having the right to your own actions because it is part of an essential mechanism which is due to human nature, and were to pursue that line of thinking, then he would have a defense, because he could say that much the way the person has the right not to be killed before they reach the age of consciousness because they are an implicit rational being, you could say that because the survival mechanism of the person is inherently linked, even if implicitly, to autonomy and the exercise of reason, that therefore there is a right according to nature to the person to self-ownership, then he would have better grounds to stand on. The problem is that I think that then that would interfere with other implications of libertarian theory that he wishes to avoid, which is why he rejected the Randian Rothbardian configuration in the first place.
Yes. And lastly, we have Hoppe's argumentation ethics, which essentially states that the only reason why anybody would consent to a peaceful dialogue, debate, discussion to resolve a dispute rather than violence is if everybody already implicitly assumed the non-aggression axiom. And as such, since he also purports you could not justify doing this under any other circumstance. We all must implicitly accept the non-aggression principle. Therefore, having a debate constitutes the support of a non-aggression principle. And that's just on the face of it clearly absurd, because there are numerous philosophical positions one could take which would justify having a reasonable debate with someone rather than resorting to maximum application of violence. One might be a fairly consequentialist argument. Well, violence is expensive, war is expensive, and the results are often uncertain. So why not go for something that's more certain and less risky? Another one might be, well, what if you're a pacifist? Or what if you believe that God owns everyone, and unless God gave you permission to hurt his property, you shouldn't do it? It doesn't at all follow that that's the only possible justification for having a peaceful dialogue with someone. And I don't remember all the details, but I remember a few years back, even Robert Murphy wrote an essay, a libertarian paper criticizing Hoppe's argumentation ethics. And lastly, argumentation ethics was invented by Jürgen Habermas to defend a kind of progressive socialism. So how would you then differentiate? Habermas would just say, well, Hoppe, you agree with me implicitly.
I think that, as you've pointed out before, that argumentation ethics shares a problem with the Rothbardian justification for the non-aggression principle, in that it attempts to defend more ground than it's capable of defending. If you wanted to use argumentation ethics to say that one has the right to argue or to settle disputes peacefully some of the time, and therefore there is a kind of inherent contradiction in, say, total communism, because we are just having a discussion and therefore we settle debates through peaceful interactions, then obviously that has some validity. But at the same time, that's defending so little ground that it is not necessarily worth one's time. However, if you decide to be absolute about it and to say that that human conflict without the that human conflict would be impossible without the or with the observance of the non-aggression principle, that human conflict would be impossible, and that by speaking we are already assenting to resolving our means by peaceful methods, that really only demonstrates that that's desirable some of the time. I do not really understand why, like with the Ayn Rand argument, where you can say, well, man's reason is necessary for his survival sometimes. That doesn't imply that it's necessary in all cases whatsoever. Likewise, if a desire for peaceful resolutions is implied to the extent that we're having the conversation, that doesn't mean that it implies the desire for us to engage in purely voluntary interactions all of the time. So it's once again the burden, well, not the burden of proof, but in order to, yes, these arguments demonstrate something, but in order to demonstrate their absoluteness, you have to venture into the realm of empirical claims, at which point you're no longer the a priorist that you present yourself as being. Also, I don't really accept the Hoppian assertion that human conflict would be impossible if the non-aggression principle were followed, or if scarcity wouldn't exist. He even says if scarcity didn't exist, that human conflict would be impossible, implying that therefore peaceful allocation of resources can perfectly circumvent conflict. Well, what if you have a religious zealot who feels that it's his right to save every soul, no matter how many of them there are? Well, there's no, the person could have 1 million souls. He still needs to save every one of them. They could have infinite souls. Therefore, he would need to compel the infinite number of souls using violence. So even in the abstract, I don't really see how how the non-existence of scarcity would even reduce human conflict, which once again leads us into the realm of empirical observation, which is that from which they perpetually recommend that we withdraw our attention.
Exactly. Now, a related issue are some thoughts brought up by a friend of mine who's been on the show before, Logos. I think you might remember Right Ruminations being in at least one or two shows with him already. His problem with the idea of the non-aggression principle is that you can envision three types of interactions between two people that own property, one person that owns property, and one that doesn't. Two people that don't own property but are on the property of someone else. And I suppose for logical consistency, two people that don't have property and are on land that's unowned. If two people who have property have a dispute, then they can both, use the mechanisms provided by libertarianism to resolve that dispute. If you have someone who has private property and then someone who doesn't, well, then the person who doesn't is at an extreme disadvantage, because if everything is privately owned in a libertarian society, where does he go? Well, he can only go where people consent for him to be. But if he doesn't already own any private property, then he's in a pickle about where he's going to actually sleep and who's going to live with, because everybody's going to be like, well, you can't legally be here unless you do X, Y, and Z. Or maybe you have two people who don't own anything but happen to be on someone else's property. So the third person could then impose his will on the other two, forcing one person to do some sort of heinous act to, C could force B to do some act to A that we would otherwise consider morally heinous. But it's okay because A and B don't own the land they're on, and C owns the land, and the only way they can stay there is if C compels A to do something to B and B to A. And then if nobody owns any property and they're not on any owned property, maybe they're on the high seas, well, then it's difficult to envision how they then could resolve a dispute. And I think the ultimate point that he's getting at here is obviously the donut problem. Let's say you are in the middle of a donut that was homesteaded. And because the guy owns the ring, he owns the airspace, he owns the land underneath it, there's no way for anybody to give you food or supplies. And he could just basically starve you out and kill you without any violation of the NAP. An act like that, under normal circumstances, even most people, including most libertarians, would find to be morally heinous. But yet, none of that is an actual violation of the non-aggression principle, which creates a very strange relationship. The idea then becomes the act in itself isn't really heinous, no matter how heinous it might otherwise be. It's only contextually heinous based on the conditions under which it is reported. So, for example, if A is on C's property and C says, well, the only way for A to be there is if he kills B. Well, they're both trespassers, and if that's the terms that they agreed to stay on the property, then A didn't commit murder. But it sure looks like it to everybody else outside the system. And we have a lot of these strange moral hazards, which according to Logos just implies people with property can do whatever they want with the people who don't have property.
This makes for a very interesting transition into an aspect of this discussion that I wanted to cover. Take this donut problem, or a situation where, to make it more immediate, let's say a situation where somebody's house is in an intersection of converging roads, and he wants to move, he wants to leave, he wants to go shop or what have you, but he can't do so without passing anyone else's property. Or a situation where, say, the whole world is owned, everything is private property, there's nothing left to homestead. That is all the land which is currently occupied by the state has been transformed into private property. That no or very few libertarians would would say, well, at that point we'll just have to kill him, or he'll have to starve in his house or whatever if they won't let him pass. And so they decide to come up with various forms of qualified property, such as somehow your property, you don't have exclusive rights to against trespassers if that's the only way he can get out, and things of this nature, which are really the attempts to kind of wiggle out of a logical corner that they have painted themselves into, which really gets me to a problem which is not even a problem with libertarianism. It's a problem with libertarians, plural, in that they could, if they were willing to admit epistemic fallibility, actually make more cogent arguments for their position. And the reason that I think this is because I often try to make arguments in favor of libertarianism myself. And in the past, I've tried to, or I've had certain assumptions about how libertarians would even think. And it's funny that the extent to which libertarians have the option of accepting these solutions and choose not to because they wouldn't be absolute or a prioristic enough. So, for example, my way of looking at it, if I were trying to argue for the libertarian position, would just be to say that, like with private property, your ability to own a certain piece of land is conditional on certain circumstances. So if you use it for a certain amount of time, or you are or it has a certain value with respect to a certain thing you're doing, or it's like you've made an agreement with the person next door that, well, this is where we'll draw the line between your land and my land, and because we just want to approximate the kind of private property we need to function as individuals, that we'll make some assumptions of convenience. That's not airtight in terms of an a prioristic theory, but there's an inner logic to it. And by that inner logic, you could perfectly well make the argument that, well, you own this property, but you kind of own it on the assumption that anyone who's completely blocked by it is allowed to pass. So, your complete ownership of it will be temporarily suspended if you built it with the knowledge that you'd block the person next door into starvation. And this is really the kind of way that I think would make a better argument for the non-aggression principle if you just said, look, man does provide for himself using his own reason through the development of technology, and he's not as capable of doing it on instinct as animals are. And we can see that just because of the empirical benefits of this, that there is a natural law that maybe we can't deduce totally a priori, but we can kind of theologize about it and say, like, well, there's such a clear pattern here that there must be something deeper or essentially here, in which case it does become a sort of synthetic knowledge. I think that that is really where a more honest libertarian justification would come from. That really they probably would be more likely to make if they were sitting down and thinking, I want to justify this position, or not even I want to justify it, I think this, why do I really think this? And then they actually gave you the steps that they took to arrive there and said, this is why I honestly think this, as opposed to starting with the conclusion and then thinking, well, what's the most absolute way that I can be seen to have demonstrated this?
Yeah, and you're correct to point out at the beginning of this conversation that this doesn't necessarily, this whole investigation of the a priori justification or for the non-aggression principle or deontological libertarianism doesn't necessarily preclude libertarianism as a political ideology, because you might have consequentialist or empiricist justifications for it. And for example, my favorite libertarian commentator, David Friedman, does exactly that. he gave an account of how he had a discussion with his father, Milton, over whether a purely private market society could work, i.e., in providing the difficult questions like healthcare, national defense, and things like that, versus a public-private society like what we have today. And he said that his father said it's plausible but probably wouldn't work. And David said, well, I think it's plausible and probably would work. And I really think that's what libertarians have to be comfortable with, is that level of uncertainty. And I think because David is comfortable with admitting that level of a lack of certainty, and the importance of empirical observation in the historical record, oddly enough, even though from the absolute position of the commanding heights of axioms, it might appear that David makes a less compelling case for libertarianism, looking at the actual arguments he makes based on experience and history, he makes a surprisingly stronger claim for libertarianism. I would argue a much stronger claim than you would get from deontological libertarians. So I think really David Friedman is doing exactly what you said a libertarian should do and yielding commensurate results.
I would agree, and I would say to them that just so that any prospective libertarians would understand that I'm not being confrontational about this, that you wouldn't even have to go as far as Friedman. You could make a synthetic argument. You could look at it and say, well, there are certain things that reason recommends to us in light of certain empirical observations, and that in the empirical observations there may be certain things that could be at least apprehended as holding some kind of legal validity, so long as they're not known or they're not stated as absolutely airtight, certain absolute forms of knowledge, that there's nothing even saying that you couldn't have some synthesis between the a prioristic and the empirical explanation. I will also say as a final word that this relates to the question I had asked Keith Preston last week about, are there any left-wing anarchists who believe in the non-aggression principle minus private property, and how I haven't really been able to see many of them. And I think it's because that's not the way people have looked at the non-aggression principle. If you did just look at the non-aggression principle not as inherently about these technical definitions of ownership or how you own things or the definition of property, then you would basically just be arguing that from a kind of halfway rational, halfway empirical point of view, that, well, that it is, there's a fittingness to not initiating aggression against one another, and maybe private property is necessary to facilitate that or to really make that work in any meaningful way, then you very well could have certain left anarchists who really do believe in the non-aggression principle in that sense, but don't buy that private property is a necessary construct in order to facilitate that. And I think that there would just be a greater sense of honesty and of intellectual flexibility that ultimately would be more convincing because of its honesty.
Well, this was a very stimulating conversation. Right Ruminations, thanks again for participating. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.